Let's talk about stablecoins. It's a growing corner of crypto, drawing attention from both regulators and investors. Unlike Bitcoin, with its volatile swings in either direction, stablecoins designed to do one thing: keep their value stable. This can be achieved by being backed by reserve assets. Many are pegged one-to-one to the US dollar, acting like a digital version of cash that lives on the blockchain. Well, that's good to know on a day like today, because stablecoin issuer Circle filed to take that company public with a $6.7 billion valuation. And for more, we're bringing in now Ben McMillan, Chief Investment Officer at IDX Advisors. Firm has more than $97 million in assets under management. Ben, always good to see you. So kind of it's a stablecoin moment, Ben. I got the Circle news we just discussed, have the Senate advancing legislation to regulate stablecoins. Ben, what do you make of it all?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of hit two important nails on the head. The first of which is the regulatory landscape. So if you go back to kind of the previous administration, who everybody knew was no real friend of crypto, but in particular, stablecoins really suffered. And like you said at the beginning of the segment, the stablecoins are important because this is the on-ramp for Main Street to get into crypto. A lot of people don't necessarily want the volatility of crypto, but they like the idea of making payments in Bitcoin, for example, or just generally having a store of value that's not as volatile as something like a Bitcoin. And so stablecoins is huge. I think JP Morgan actually put out a piece fairly recently that said they expect the stablecoin market to grow from roughly $2.5 billion currently to over $500 billion in the next decade. So again, I mean, this is a big deal. And one of the biggest things I think is now we have a much more clear and friendly regulatory guidance, not just for stablecoins, but crypto in general.
So Ben, it's Al Root here. Now, I think we should probably eat our broccoli. Just contrast the stable coin, what am I getting, versus a Bitcoin in terms of that store of value, what's right for different people, and then maybe tie it in with how this IPO fits in.
Yeah, so stablecoins are crucial because, like we were just saying at the top of the segment, they're generally backed, they're backed by, US dollar or some, definitive store of value. Now, this raises an important consideration as it relates to Circle specifically, because Circle is US based, US domiciled, and US regulated. If you look at the biggest player in the stablecoin market, that's Tether, and in recent years there's been a lot of concerns about what exactly is backing a Tether, what is in their treasury. They've had audits, there's been back and forths, and so when you look at broad swaths of Americans, including institutional players like banks, the fact that Circle, which by the way has always done a good job in my opinion of touting transparency and really opening up the books in terms of what is a USDC, that's the name of their stablecoin, what is that backed by, and in this coin, it's just plain Jane simple US dollars. So again, it's gives people a lot of comfort if they like the idea of potentially utilizing crypto, but they don't want the daily fluctuations of a Bitcoin or an Ethereum or something that is not backed by fiat currency. A stablecoin is a US regulated stablecoin is a great option.
So Ben, we've been talking stablecoin, but while I have you, I do also want your take on all things Bitcoin, because the move we've seen there, Ben, over the past roughly month has been impressive, and I'm curious what you chalk that up to. Is that just general risk-on backdrop? Is that investors banking on, as we've been discussing here, a more generally friendly regulatory environment? What are the reasons, Ben?
So that's interesting. We've been in the Bitcoin space for a long time, managing, accounts for investors going back to 2019. And so we've gotten an interesting perspective kind of along the way in terms of, the sentiment around Bitcoin. And this most recent move was interesting because, with Bitcoin, risk on is always part of it. But it's not like in past moves. A lot of this was kind of true decoupling. If we look at some of the biggest moves on Bitcoin on certain days, it's when we had bond market volatility. It's when we had concerns about, the US's fiscal debt situation, where Bitcoin really had the biggest moves. Coinbase actually came out and said they were seeing record amounts of buying by sovereign wealth funds, international players. This lines up with what we've seen in the gold market, frankly, where foreign central banks have been the biggest marginal buyers really since COVID. And a lot of that you can attribute directly to concerns about, the US simply printing too much money. And so we attribute a lot of this recent Bitcoin move to kind of, whale wallets you can of course see online. These are the big wallets that are, buying up Bitcoin. But again, more kind of institutional sovereign type players as a potential geopolitical store of value in a world where fiat volatility is only going to increase.
Now, Ben, you mentioned Coinbase, right? And you can go to the gold miner debate, Coinbase, Bitcoin debate as we get this Circle IPO. What would I want to say? Basically, what do you prefer? But it's more investor oriented. Who is more interested in the Circle IPO, and then who is more interested in the USDC?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, because it is the old, as you say, kind of gold versus picks and shovels approach. And even early on in kind of the life cycle of Bitcoin from an investing perspective, we saw a lot of people. We talked to a lot of clients that said, "Listen, we don't believe in Bitcoin, but we like the kind of infrastructure approach, or the picks and shovels approach." And so something like Coinbase, we saw a lot of institutional demand from groups exactly like that. They didn't necessarily like the idea of the volatility of Bitcoin. In some cases, they didn't even necessarily believe in the value prop of the Bitcoin, but they liked the servicing layer. So I think we're going to see that type of demand for Circle. Now, I will say we've seen a lot more institutional demand. There's been a lot of institutional normalization for Bitcoin. BlackRock now has put it in portfolios. So I think that pie is even bigger. But Cathie Woods, I think, came out and said they'd be interested in potentially up to $150 million of the Circle IPO. So there's definitely going to be demand from kind of the infrastructure buyers of the Bitcoin ecosystem, but I think also just broader crypto investors in general.
Ben, great to see you as always. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen.